Welcome to Chronological Fiction, where real-world events meet the power of storytelling. We're here to breathe new life into history's most interesting moments by turning them into unique narratives. Join our community by subscribing, and let's explore the stories that shaped our world.
The wound in the earth did not bleed red. It bled a slurry of ancient mud, liquefied methane, and the putrid stench of things that had been dead for 200,000 years. Dr. Irina Volkov stood on the precipice of the Batagaika Crater, her boots sinking into the softening moss of the Sakha Republic's tundra. To the locals, this was the gateway to hell, a title that felt less like folklore and more like a geological diagnosis with every passing summer. The Mega-slump stretched out before her like a jagged, mile-long tadpole carved into the Siberian taiga, its head a towering wall of exposed permafrost that shimmered with an oily, dark moisture. As the sun beat down with an unnatural intensity, a heat wave that felt more like a fever than a season, she could hear it. The crater was talking. It was a cacophony of wet thuds, the sound of massive blocks of frozen earth detaching from the rim and plunging into the abyss below. It was the sound of the world losing its grip on the past. Beside her, Ellie, a Yakut guide whose face was a map of deep-set wrinkles and ancestral patience, stood motionless. He wasn't looking at the GPS monitors or the thermal imaging cameras Irina's team had painstakingly calibrated. He was looking at the birds, the way they refused to fly over the center of the depression. "The spirits here are waking up, Doctor," Ellie whispered, his voice barely audible over the constant drip, drip, drip of the thawing cliffs. They were never meant to see the sun again. When you peel back the skin of the world, you shouldn't be surprised when the bones begin to rattle. Irina, a paleoclimatologist who dealt in ice cores and isotopic signatures, wanted to offer a rational rebuttal about thermokarst processes and the positive feedback loops of methane release, but the sheer scale of the Batagaika defied her charts. It was growing at a rate of 30 meters a year, a geological blink of an eye. The permafrost, which had acted as the structural glue of the Siberian wilderness since the middle of the Quaternary period, was failing. And as it failed, it was revealing secrets that had been safely entombed since the days of the Neanderthals. They descended into the throat of the beast the following morning. The air inside the crater was heavy, saturated with a damp, prehistoric humidity that clung to their lungs. The walls around them were a vertical museum of deep time. At the top layers, they saw the roots of modern larches and the remains of Soviet-era logging equipment, swallowed by the expanding rim in the 1960s. But as they descended further, the layers darkened and compressed. Dr. Volkov traced her hand along a vein of Yedoma, ice-rich permafrost that contained massive amounts of organic carbon. This was the fuel for the fire. As this ice melted, the carbon within was being devoured by microbes, waking from a multi-millennial slumber to exhale a steady, invisible plume of methane and carbon dioxide. It was a chemical resurrection. "Look at this," she murmured, pointing to a protrusion in the mud. It wasn't a rock. It was the femur of a woolly rhinoceros, polished by the melting ice, looking as fresh as if the animal had fallen yesterday. The crater wasn't just a hole, it was a time machine stuck in reverse, vomiting the Pleistocene into the Anthropocene. By the third day of their expedition, the temperature spiked to a record 38 degrees Celsius. The stability of the crater's head wall reached a breaking point. Irina was deep in the lower jaw of the slump, collecting soil samples from a layer of earth that hadn't seen light for 140,000 years, when the ground beneath her feet vibrated with a low-frequency hum. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a structural collapse. High above, a section of the rim the size of a city block sheared off. The sound was like a thunderclap muffled by a velvet curtain. Tons of ancient mud and ice surged downward in a slow-motion cascade. "Move to the central ridge," Ellie shouted, grabbing Irina's arm. They scrambled up a spine of relatively stable sediment as the debris flow roared past them, a river of melted history. In the wake of the collapse, the air grew thick with a scent that made Irina's stomach churn. A sweet, cloying aroma of rot mixed with something sharp, like ozone. The collapse had opened a new fissure, a dark, jagged rent in the very bottom of the crater that seemed to lead into the absolute dark. They should have turned back. The safety protocols were clear. Any significant structural failure meant immediate evacuation. But as the dust settled, Arena's headlamp caught something in the newly exposed wall of the fissure. It was a geometric shadow, too regular to be a natural formation of ice or stone. Driven by a mix of scientific obsession and a dawning, irrational dread, she approached the edge of the new opening. Behind her, Ellie was chanting softly in a dialect she didn't recognize, his eyes wide with a primal terror. As she peered into the dark, she realized the gateway to hell wasn't just a metaphor. The melting permafrost hadn't just revealed bones and bacteria. It had unzipped a pocket of the atmosphere that had been trapped since the last interglacial period. The air coming out of the fissure was cold, violently, impossibly cold, and it carried the sound of a rhythmic, metallic tapping. It was the sound of the Earth's cooling system failing, a frantic, mechanical stuttering as the hidden layers of the planet reacted to the sudden intrusion of modern heat. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, blood-red shadows across the Batagaika, Arena realized the horrifying truth of why the crater was growing so fast. It wasn't just the surface heat. Something within the Earth was pulling the warmth down, a thermal vacuum created by the massive void left by the melting ice. The more it grew, the more surface area was exposed to the sun. The more it melted, the more the ground collapsed. And the more the ground collapsed, the more the ancient trapped gases pressurized the crust from below. It was a self-sustaining engine of destruction. She looked at her monitors one last time. The methane readings weren't just high, they were off the charts, indicating a massive burp of gas was imminent. The gate was preparing to swing wide. "We have to go," she whispered, the scientific detachment finally shattering. "It's not just a crater, Ellie, it's a mouth, and it's finally hungry enough to finish what it started." They fled as the first of the methane bubbles began to rupture the surface of the mud, a series of wet, popping sounds that echoed like footsteps following them out of the dark. The Batagaika would not stop until it had consumed the forest, the camp, and perhaps the very memory of the ice that had once held the world together. The ascent out of the Batagaika's gullet was a desperate, lung-searing scramble against the very physics of collapse. Every handhold Arena found seemed to disintegrate into a slurry of dead ice and ancient silt, the ground beneath her manifesting a treacherous fluidity that defied the laws of solid earth. Behind them, the fissure they had discovered wasn't merely emitting gas. It was exhaling a low-frequency vibration that resonated in the marrow of her bones, a subsonic groan that felt like the planet itself was adjusting its heavy tectonic limbs. The sky above, once a pale Siberian blue, had curdled into a bruised purple, choked by the sudden release of particulate matter and the haze of a distant forest fire ignited by the same relentless heatwave. Ellie moved with a frantic, rhythmic grace, his traditional knowledge of the land's hidden contours proving more vital than Arena's topographical maps. He pulled her upward just as a massive section of the head wall, a frozen cliff containing the frozen ghosts of the Pleistocene, gave way, sending a cascade of boulders and frozen mud into the spot where they had stood seconds before. The sound of the impact was followed by a sickening hiss, the sound of pressurized methane escaping the newly opened wounds in the permafrost, a billion microscopic size of ancient bacteria finally meeting the modern air. Once they breached the rim and collapsed onto the relative stability of the moss-covered tundra, the world did not offer the sanctuary Arena expected. The landscape was warped. The drunken forests, larch trees tilted at impossible angles as the ground beneath them melted, seemed to have shifted further in the hours they were below. The horizon was shimmering with a heat distortion that made the distant mountains look like they were melting into the sky. Arena turned her head to look back into the abyss. The crater was no longer just a geological feature, it was a living, breathing entity. The burp she had feared was beginning. Across the vast floor of the slump, giant domes of earth were rising like blisters, pushed upward by the immense pressure of methane trapped for eons. As they watched, one of these blisters erupted with a sound like a cannon shot, ejecting a plume of grey mud and invisible gas hundreds of feet into the air. The concentration was so high that the air around the eruption point seemed to warp and ripple. a localized distortion of reality fueled by the sudden liberation of 200,000 years of sequestered carbon. "It is not just the air that is changing, Arena," Ellie said, his voice trembling as he pointed toward their base camp, a cluster of high-tech tents and solar arrays a kilometer away. "The water, the spirits of the deep are rising with the heat." He was right. The small thermokarst lakes that dotted the plateau were bubbling furiously, their surfaces white with foam. The smell of sulfur and ancient decay was now omnipresent, a thick, cloying miasma that seemed to coat the back of her throat. Arena reached for her satellite phone, her fingers shaking. She needed to transmit the data. The isotopic readings from the deep fissure were unlike anything in the scientific literature. They didn't just suggest a warming trend, they suggested a catastrophic tipping point had been breached. A moment where the permafrost's degradation became a runaway reaction that no human intervention could halt. But as she powered on the device, the screen flickered with a strange geometric static. The same patterns she had seen in the shadows of the fissure were now dancing across her digital display, a rhythmic interference that pulsed in time with the tapping sound they had heard in the depths. As night fell, though in the Siberian summer, night was merely a bruised, eternal twilight, the true scale of the Batagaika's awakening became apparent. The team's sensors began to record a series of micro-earthquakes, centered directly beneath the crater's head. It wasn't tectonic movement, it was a structural failure on a regional scale. The melting of the massive ice wedges that acted as the skeletal framework of the Yakutian plains was causing the very crust to subside. Arena sat in the flickering light of the mess tent, staring at a cross-section of the crater on her laptop. The gateway to hell was growing exponentially, its edges devouring the forest at a rate that would see it double in size within weeks, not years. But there was something else, a thermal anomaly deep within the central fissure. It was a heat source, but it wasn't coming from the sun. It was coming from below. It was as if the opening of the crater had acted as a chimney, allowing the surface heat to penetrate into a deep, volatile pocket of geothermal energy, or, more terrifyingly, triggering an exothermic chemical reaction in the ancient organic matter that was now rapidly decomposing. The final realization came when the birds began to fall. Not from the heat, but from the silence. A profound, unnatural quiet had descended over the tundra, broken only by the rhythmic thudding of the crater's expanding walls. Thousands of migratory birds, sensing the change in the atmospheric chemistry, were dropping from the sky, their systems overwhelmed by the invisible clouds of methane and CO2 that were now pooling in the lowlands. Arena stepped out of the tent, the air feeling heavy and wrong against her skin. She looked toward the Batagaika, which was now glowing with a faint bioluminescent light, the result of specialized ancient anaerobic bacteria reacting to the oxygen-rich surface air. It looked like a neon scar on the face of the Earth. "We aren't just witnesses to a climate event," she whispered to the empty, stifling wind. "We are witnesses to a rebirth. The Earth is shedding its old skin, and it doesn't care that we are still standing on it." The gateway to hell hadn't just opened to let the past out, it had opened to pull the future in, into a dark, hot, and suffocating world that humanity was never meant to inhabit. The bioluminescence radiating from the throat of the Batagaika was not the steady, gentle glow of deep-sea organisms. It was a rhythmic, pulsing emerald and bruised violet that seemed to syncopate with the very tremors of the subsiding Earth. As Arena stood on the edge of the camp, she watched through her thermal goggles as the heat signature of the crater shifted from a uniform red to a chaotic swirl of impossible blues, temperatures that shouldn't exist in a thawing mud pit. The air had become a pressurized soup of heavy gases, and every breath felt like inhaling liquid silt. She realized with a jolt of scientific terror that the ancient bacteria theory was insufficient. This was a massive subterranean chemical furnace, a geochemical perfect storm where the sudden introduction of oxygen to sequestered carbon, combined with the friction of millions of tons of shifting Earth, was creating a localized atmospheric anomaly. The electronic interference grew louder, a grinding static that began to resolve into a sequence of tones, low, guttural, and undeniably mathematical. It was as if the strata of the Earth were acting as a giant phonograph needle, playing back a record etched into the ice during the last great transition of the planet's climate. Ellie had retreated to the edge of the permafrost, where the ground was still reinforced by the roots of the ancient larches. He refused to look at the crater, his hands busy weaving a traditional protective charm from dried sedge and horsehair. But his eyes were fixed on the sky. Above the Batagaika, the clouds were beginning to rotate. A localized low-pressure cell was forming, drawing the humid, methane-rich air upward into a towering funnel that glowed with the reflected light of the abyss below. "It is calling its brothers," Ellie whispered, his voice cracking. "The ground is soft in the Yamal, in the Gidan, in the lands of the north. When the mother gate opens, the children will follow." Arena understood the terrifying implication. The Batagaika wasn't an isolated event. It was the keystone of a pan-Arctic collapse. If the pressure release here reached a critical threshold, it could trigger a chain reaction across the entire Siberian permafrost shield, a methane bomb that would render the global climate models of the last century utterly obsolete within a matter of days. She scrambled back to the comms tent, driven by a desperate need to transmit the tones, the acoustic signatures of the collapse, to the monitoring station in Yakutsk. Inside the tent, the reality of their isolation hit home. The satellite uplink was dead, but the monitors were still recording. The seismic data showed that the central fissure had widened by another 50 meters in just 3 hours. But it was the visual feed from the remote drone hovering precariously over the gateway that stopped her heart. The drone's camera, equipped with deep penetrating LiDAR, was mapping the void beneath the slurry. The images on the screen didn't show a simple cavern. They showed a labyrinth of vertical shafts and horizontal galleries, carved not by water, but by the rapid sublimation of massive ice lenses, giant blocks of pure prehistoric water that had acted as the pillars of the Siberian crust. As these pillars vanished, the ground above wasn't just sinking. It was imploding into a hollow world. In the center of the LiDAR map, at a depth of nearly 300 meters, there was a solid, non-organic mass. It was a perfect sphere of dense frozen gas, a clathrate core that had been the anchor of the Batagaika for 500,000 years. And it was vibrating. The vibration began to manifest as a physical force. The coffee in Arena's mug formed perfect Faraday ripples, and the metal poles of the tent began to sing with a high-pitched, metallic resonance. "The core is destabilizing," she breathed, her fingers flying across the keyboard to calculate the potential energy release. If that methane clathrate sphere underwent a sudden phase change from solid to gas, the resulting explosion would be equivalent to a multi-megaton blast, minus the radiation. It would be a cold explosion, a pneumatic hammer that would shatter the surrounding permafrost and send a shockwave across the Arctic Circle. She realized then that the gateway to hell was a misnomer. It was a pressure cooker, and the safety valve had been welded shut by the very mud that was supposed to contain it. The bioluminescence intensified, turning the twilight into a blinding spectral day. The smell of ozone was now so sharp it felt like needles in her nostrils. Suddenly, the ground beneath the camp gave a sickening lurch. One of the heavy equipment trailers began to slide toward the rim, its tires screaming against the slick, thawing moss. Ellie shouted something lost in the wind as a new fissure opened barely 10 meters from their sleeping quarters. From the darkness of the new rent in the earth, a fountain of pressurized, freezing water erupted, a pingo in reverse, as the weight of the collapsing landscape squeezed the subterranean aquifers like a wet sponge. The water was black, filled with the pulverized remains of a forest that had died before the first pyramids were built. Arena grabbed her hard drive and her emergency pack, leaping from the tent just as the central pole snapped under the shifting tension of the earth. She looked toward the crater and saw the headwall finally disintegrate. The towering cliff of ice and history simply vanished into the light, swallowed by a vortex of mud and gas that was now rising to meet the rotating clouds above. The gateway wasn't just growing anymore, it was ascending. The sound that followed the disintegration of the headwall was not a roar, but a terrifying, hollow whistle, the sound of a planet-sized vacuum suddenly drawing breath. For a heartbeat, the atmosphere itself seemed to pause, the wind dying instantly as the air pressure plummeted. Arena felt the blood rush to her ears, a sickening pop inside her skull as the clathrate core deep within the Batagaika finally underwent its violent transition from solid to gas. The expansion was instantaneous. The frozen sphere of methane, held in a crystalline cage of ice for 200 millennia, shattered into a volume of gas 160 times its original size. The ground beneath Arena didn't just shake, it rippled like a carpet being snapped. The cold explosion sent a shockwave of pulverized permafrost and supercritical methane upward, a translucent wall of force that shredded the remaining larch trees and vaporized the team's heavy equipment into a fine metallic mist. Arena was thrown backward, her body tumbling over the undulating moss until she slammed into the base of a tilted, half-buried stone, a relic of a mountain range that had been worn down to nothing by ice ages long forgotten. She gasped, her lungs struggling to find oxygen in a cloud of ancient inert gases. The air was freezing. The sudden expansion of the gas had dropped the local temperature by 40 degrees in a matter of seconds, coating the mud-slicked world in a layer of jagged, crystalline frost. Through the shimmering haze, she saw Ellie. He was standing on a ridge that shouldn't have been there, his silhouette framed against a sky that had turned a terrifying, electric teal. He wasn't running. He was looking down into the new, expanded throat of the crater, his arms outstretched. The tones were no longer coming from her equipment. They were vibrating through the air itself, a deep, melodic thrumming that felt like a chorus of tectonic plates. It was the sound of the Earth's crust resonating like a bell. As Arena struggled to her feet, her hands numb and claw-like from the sudden cold, she realized the bioluminescence had spread. The entire Batagaika was now a glowing wound, and from its center, a pillar of shimmering, ionized gas was rising into the ionosphere, connecting the deep Earth to the edge of space in a flickering bridge of emerald light. The tones were not random. As Arena's vision cleared, she saw the patterns forming in the frost on the rocks around her. Perfect, Chladni-like geometric shapes, hexagrams and spirals etched with impossible precision by the acoustic frequency of the eruption. This was the signal. It was a biological and geological reset button. The ancient microbes she had studied weren't just waking up to eat. They were part of a vast, dormant neural network that used the permafrost as a conductor. For millions of years, the ice had acted as a silencer, a dampener for a planetary biological processor. Now, with the insulation gone, the processor was back online. Her satellite phone, despite its shattered screen, began to chirp with a frantic, rhythmic persistence. It wasn't a call, it was a data stream. As the device struggled to interpret the signal, words began to scroll across the cracked LCD. Yamal active, Jaidan active, Alaska North Slope active, Taymir active. The children were indeed following the mother. The Batagaika was the conductor, and the entire Arctic was beginning to sing the same terrifying, beautiful song of collapse. They had to move. The ridge Ellie was standing on began to groan, the dead ice beneath it groaning under the weight of the atmospheric shift. Arena lunged forward, grabbing Ellie by the ruff of his heavy parkas. "We have to get to the high plateau," she screamed over the rising whistle of the wind. "The subsidence is moving outward." Ellie turned to her, and for the first time, his eyes weren't filled with fear, but with a strange, haunting clarity. "The ice was a prison, Arena," he said, his voice perfectly clear despite the cacophony. "But it wasn't a prison for the spirits. It was a prison for the heat. The Earth is finally sweating out its fever." As they scrambled away from the rim, the ground behind them simply ceased to be. The edge of the Batagaika was expanding at a visible speed now. A mega-slump that had transformed into a self-propagating wave of liquefaction. The forest was being swallowed whole, the ancient trees disappearing into the glowing slurry like matchsticks into a whirlpool. They reached the ATV, half buried in frost and mud, and Arena bypassed the ignition, hot-wiring the engine as the ground beneath the tires turned to the consistency of quicksand. The machine roared to life, its treads biting into the softening earth as they raced away from the growing light. In the rearview mirror, Arena saw the final transformation of the gateway. The central pillar of light had reached the clouds, and the rotating storm system above was now a perfect glowing eye, staring down into the heart of the crater. The tones reached a crescendo, a frequency so high it shattered the glass of the ATV's headlights. And then silence. A silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The light didn't fade, it solidified. The Batagaika was no longer a hole in the ground, it was a permanent feature of the atmosphere, a vertical corridor of energy that was pulling the very carbon from the surrounding air and sequestering it back into the deep, dark earth in a violent reverse respiration. The planet wasn't just dying, it was performing a desperate scorched earth surgery on itself, and humanity was merely the bacteria being purged from the wound. As they reached the rocky heights of the Verkhoyansk range, Arena looked back across the Siberian expanse. The horizon was dotted with similar pillars of light, dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, rising from the hidden corners of the tundra. The gateways were all open. The world she had known, a world of predictable seasons and stable ice, was gone, replaced by a landscape of glowing ghosts and singing earth. She looked at her hands, still stained with the 200,000-year-old mud of the crater, and saw that her own skin was beginning to shimmer with that same emerald hue. The signal wasn't just in the air. It was in their cells. The transition had begun, and there was no turning back the clock. The Batagaika hadn't just grown. It had won. The shimmering on Arena's skin was not a surface reflection or a trick of the bruised teal sky. It was an intracellular luminescence, a soft emerald pulse that beat in perfect synchronization with the rhythmic thrumming of the Verkhoyansk bedrock. As she gripped the cold stone of the mountain pass, she realized the tones were no longer an external sound to be measured by microphones or analyzed by software. They were a haptic frequency, a biological directive that was rewriting the very proteins in her blood. Her vision began to shift, the visible spectrum stretching into the infrared and ultraviolet, allowing her to see the massive plumes of methane not as invisible threats, but as swirling golden rivers of energy being sucked upward into the atmospheric pillars. Beside her, Ellie seemed transformed as well. His ancient weathered skin had taken on a translucent obsidian quality, and his eyes had become wide, unblinking pools of silver. He didn't need to speak for her to understand that they were no longer purely human in the way the 21st century defined the term. They were becoming conduits, biological sensors for a planet that had decided to wake up and defend itself from the fever of industrial civilization. The mud of the Batagaika, which had entered her pores during their desperate climb, was acting as a catalyst, a piece of ancient genetic code that had been waiting for the right thermal trigger to initiate a planetary reset protocol. Across the globe, the great muting had begun. In the glass and steel canyons of New York, the neon labyrinths of Tokyo, and the historical arteries of London, the tones arrived not as sound, but as a total failure of the digital world. The frequency emitted by the Batagaika and its sister gateways was a harmonic that vibrated at the exact resonance of silicon. Microchips, the tiny hearts of the modern world, didn't just fail, they underwent a physical transformation, their crystalline structures shattering into a fine, inert powder. Planes fell silently from the sky as their fly-by-wire systems evaporated. The global internet, the nervous system of humanity, vanished in a single shivering breath. The world became suddenly, terrifyingly quiet, the roar of engines replaced by the low, guttural song of the earth. People stepped out of their darkened homes to see the sky filled with the same emerald aurora that Arena was witnessing from the Siberian heights. This wasn't a solar flare or a magnetic storm. It was the atmosphere itself being ionized by the massive release of prehistoric gases and the strange bioluminescent bacteria that were now colonizing the troposphere. The oxygen levels were spiking as the reverse respiration of the craters began to pump out a revitalized ancient air, an atmosphere that was richer, heavier, and vibrated with a vitality that felt like a physical weight against the lungs of those still trapped in the old world. As Arena and Ellie moved deeper into the Verkhoyansk range, the landscape around them began to undergo a rapid, surreal metamorphosis. The drunken forests they had left behind were not dying. They were being repurposed. The tilting larch trees were merging with the thawing mud, their roots thickening into fleshy, translucent anchors that pulsated with the same green light as Arena's skin. The permafrost wasn't just melting into water, it was becoming a primordial jelly, a nutrient-rich world soup from which things that had been extinct for millions of years were beginning to coalesce. Arena watched in stunned silence as a flock of birds, creatures that looked like a cross between modern gulls and long-extinct Archaeopteryx, emerged from a steaming fissure in the mountainside, their wings shimmering with the same iridescent teal as the sky. Evolution, which usually moved at the glacial pace of eons, was now occurring in minutes, fueled by the massive energy release from the Earth's core. The gateway to hell had turned out to be a womb, and the labor pains were shaking the foundations of the continents. By the second day of their mountain trek, the signal reached its full maturity. Arena's satellite phone, now a useless slab of metal and dead silicon, began to glow with its own internal light. The tones had coalesced into a single, unified consciousness that flooded her mind. Not with words, but with images and sensations. She saw the history of the Earth as a series of breaths, of which the human era was merely a brief, shallow gasp. She felt the weight of the ice ages, the slow grind of glaciers, and the sudden, violent heat of volcanic eruptions. She understood that the Batagaika Crater was a thermostat that had been triggered by the very warming humanity had unleashed. The planet was sweating out the fever by creating a new high-energy environment that would sequester carbon at a rate 10,000 times faster than any natural forest. But it was an environment that had no place for the fragile, carbon-based infrastructure of the human race. The cities were being reclaimed by the silence, the concrete cracking as the new hypervital flora surged through the streets, turning the monuments of the 21st century into the trellises for a new glowing jungle. They reached the summit of a peak the locals called the Great Mother, and from there, Arena could see the true scale of the transformation. The Siberian plain, once a monotonous stretch of taiga and tundra, was now a kaleidoscopic tapestry of glowing craters and shimmering rivers of gas. The pillars of light were no longer just columns. They had begun to weave together, forming a shimmering emerald canopy that spanned the entire horizon. The gateways were stitching the earth and the sky into a single, integrated organism. Ellie turned to Arena, his silver eyes reflecting the end of the world and the beginning of something else. "The old spirits are gone, Arena," he said, his voice resonating within her skull without the need for air. "The new ones are here, and they are hungry for a world that knows how to breathe again." Arena looked down at her hands. They were no longer flesh and bone, but a complex branching structure of light and ancient silt. She realized she wasn't just a witness anymore. She was a participant. The Batagaika hadn't just grown to swallow the forest, it had grown to swallow the very concept of humanity, inviting those who survived to become something entirely different, something that could walk through the fire of the new world without burning. The silence of the great muting was shattered not by the voice of the earth, but by the jagged mechanical scream of a dying era. From the western horizon, where the Ural Mountains stood as a jagged spine against the teal sky, a fleet of shielded interceptors, remnants of a forgotten military contingency, tore through the ionized atmosphere. These were not the sleek, silicon-dependent jets of the previous decade. They were analog behemoths retrofitted with vacuum tube avionics and lead-lined fuselages, specifically designed to operate in the wake of a high-altitude nuclear pulse. They were the iron ghosts of a desperate hegemony sent by a bunker-bound command to neutralize the thermal anomalies. To the generals huddled in deep-crust shelters, the Batagaika wasn't a rebirth. It was a resource theft by the planet itself, a rogue geological event that had to be disciplined with kinetic force. Arena, standing on the obsidian peak of the Great Mother, felt the vibration of their engines as a physical violation. It was a discordant, grating frequency that clashed with the harmonic tones still resonating in her blood. She could see the heat signatures of the jets, angry pulsing smears of infrared, approaching the emerald pillars of the gateway. Beside her, Ellie did not move, but his silver eyes darkened until they matched the depth of the Siberian night. The air around him began to shimmer with a localized distortion, a ripple in the world soup that had replaced the atmosphere. "They come with fire to stop the rain," he said, his voice now a multi-layered resonance that seemed to vibrate from the rocks themselves. "They think the mother is a door they can kick shut." As the lead interceptor dived toward the central pillar of the Batagaika, it unleashed a salvo of thermobaric missiles. The weapons were designed to consume the oxygen in a localized area, creating a vacuum that would collapse any structure, biological or otherwise. But as the missiles crossed the threshold of the emerald canopy, the physics of the new world took hold. The tones shifted, the atmospheric density within the pillar's influence spiked to that of water, and the missiles didn't explode. They simply slowed, their kinetic energy being absorbed and transmuted into the glowing light of the vortex. The iron ghosts were suddenly flying through a medium they hadn't been built for, their wings shearing off as the air itself became as solid as diamond in response to their aggression. Arena watched as the first jet disintegrated, not into fire and shrapnel, but into a shower of sparkling crystalline dust. The signal from the crater had intercepted the mechanical intent and dismantled it at the molecular level. It wasn't an act of war, it was an immune response. The Batagaika was an apex organism, and the military's hardware was merely a foreign pathogen being neutralized by a planetary white blood cell. As the remaining jets attempted to pull away, the emerald pillar flared with a blinding intensity. A beam of focused, coherent light, a tectonic laser fueled by the pressure of the shifting plates, shot upward from the heart of the crater. It didn't just destroy the planes, it rewrote them. The metal of the fuselages, the oil in the engines, and the very bodies of the pilots were caught in a transmutational field. In mid-air, the debris didn't fall. It began to grow. The shrapnel merged with the ancient bacteria in the clouds, forming a new kind of airborne life, metallic-winged sky grazers that began to circle the pillar, feeding on the very methane that had once been a greenhouse threat. The horror Arena felt as a scientist was rapidly being replaced by a terrifying, ecstatic awe. She looked down at her own hands again, which were now translucent webs of light and mineral. The human part of her brain, the part that categorized, feared, and sought to control, was being overwritten by a vast geological empathy. She could feel the expansion of the crater not as a measurement on a map, but as the stretching of her own skin. The Batagaika was no longer a hole. It had begun to extrude a physical architecture. From the depths of the slurry, towering spires of living silt were rising. These were not buildings, but calcified structures of compressed carbon and ice, spiraling upward like the shells of gargantuan nautiluses. They were data spires, biological hard drives that were recording the transition of the planet, storing the genetic blueprints of everything that was being dismantled so it could be reassembled in the new high-oxygen epoch. The gateway to hell was manifesting a city of the deep, a cathedral of the Pleistocene rising to meet the sky. A sudden sharp pain lanced through Arena's consciousness. A remnant of a digital signal, a ghost of the old world's internet that had somehow survived in a hardened relay station near the Arctic coast. It was a video feed, grainy and flickering, projected directly into her mind by the signal. It showed the world's major cities. They were not just quiet, they were transforming. In Paris, the Eiffel Tower was being encased in a sheath of bioluminescent moss that was vibrating at the frequency of the tones, turning the iron monument into a massive tuning fork. In New York, the skyscrapers were sinking into the softening asphalt as the ground beneath Manhattan underwent the same mega-slump as the Batagaika. But there was no panic in the images. People were walking out of the shadows, their skin already beginning to shimmer with the emerald glow, their faces possessed by the same haunting clarity she saw in LA. The Great Muting had been the transition period. The Great Rebirth was the reality. Humanity wasn't being extinguished, it was being harvested, its consciousness being integrated into the planetary neural network. "They will keep coming," Arena whispered, sensing the movement of more iron ghosts and ground-based remnants on the distant edges of her expanded perception. "The ones who hide in the bunkers, they won't stop until they've burned everything." Ellie turned to her, his silver eyes flashing with a cold, ancient intelligence. "Let them come, Arena. The earth has been cold for a long time. It finally has enough wood for the fire." He pointed toward the center of the Batagaika, where the core was now visible, not as a sphere of gas, but as a pulsating heart of pure liquid light. The spires of silt were leaning inward, forming a protective cradle around it. Irina realized that her mission had changed. She was no longer a scientist studying a crater. She was the translator. She was the bridge between the dying screams of the mechanical age and the first booming notes of the geological future. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, she didn't try to fight the tones. She let them fill her, her heartbeat slowing until it matched the rhythmic thumping of the Siberian crust, 200,000 years in the making. The horizon did not just rumble, it groaned under the weight of the leviathans. From the scorched remains of the southern taiga, 3 massive crawling land fortresses emerged, their silhouettes like jagged iron mountains moving on thousands of independent clanking treads. These were the bunker lords, the last vestige of the global financial and military elite, who had spent decades preparing for the end of history in deep-crust sanctums beneath the Swiss Alps and the American Rockies. They had emerged not to save humanity, but to claim the source of the signal. Their scanners, ancient and analog but shielded by meters of lead and archaic dampeners, had identified the Batagaika's core as a singularity of energy, a limitless power source that could fuel their dying machines for 1,000 years. The central Leviathan, a dreadnought named the Sovereign, bristled with diamond-tipped thermal drills and cryogenic cannons. It moved with a slow, arrogant inevitability, crushing the newly grown living silt structures beneath its multi-ton treads, leaving a trail of pulverized history in its wake. To the lords inside, the emerald glow was just a target, and the transformation of the planet was merely a hostile environment to be colonized. Irina, standing atop the data spire she had been drawn to, felt the approach of the Leviathans as a localized infection. The signal in her blood spiked, turning her vision into a stroboscopic map of structural weaknesses. She could feel the mechanical heat of the fortresses, a dry, oily, and parasitic warmth that felt like a razor blade against the humid, living heat of the crater. They still tried to measure the ocean with a thimble. Ellie's voice resonated within her, though he was now standing hundreds of meters away at the crater's edge, his body almost entirely merged with a pillar of pulsating ice. The Leviathans deployed their harvester arrays, massive telescopic arms tipped with gravitic anchors. They intended to pierce the core of the Batagaika, to tether the planetary heart and drain its pressurized methane and ionized light into their storage vats. As the first anchor slammed into the mud of the crater floor, the tones changed from a melodic thrumming to a jagged, dissonant scream. The earth didn't just shake, it recoiled. Driven by a directive she no longer possessed the will to resist, Irina turned away from the approaching machines and stepped into the spiral opening of the data spire. The interior was not a hollow room, but a pressurized chamber of liquid memory. The walls were translucent, composed of microscopic layers of ice and silt that functioned as a biological fiber optic network. As she moved deeper, the signal began to download the blueprints into her consciousness. She saw the designs for the new humanity, creatures that didn't consume the planet's resources but functioned as part of its metabolic cycle. She saw lungs designed to filter methane, skin that photosynthesized the emerald light of the pillars, and a nervous system that was permanently entangled with the Earth's geomagnetic field. It was a beautiful, terrifying architecture of survival, but the download was interrupted by a violent tremor. The Sovereign had begun its primary drill. The diamond-tipped bit, rotating at thousands of revolutions per minute, bit into the protective cradle of the core, sending a spray of pressurized, ancient slurry and sparks of dying technology into the air. The reaction from the Batagaika was instantaneous and absolute. The data spire around Irina began to vibrate at a frequency that liquefied the metal components of the Leviathan's drills. In the old world, this would have been called a piezoelectric discharge, but here it was an act of planetary speech. A wave of ultra-low frequency sound rippled outward from the core, hitting the land fortresses with the force of a tectonic hammer. The heavy iron armor of the Sovereign didn't just dent, it shattered like glass. The bunker lords inside, shielded by their lead and their arrogance, found themselves suddenly exposed to the signal. Irina could feel their terror through the network. 1,000 frantic, selfish minds suddenly forced to perceive the 4.5 billion-year history of the planet all at once. It was a cognitive overload that extinguished their individuality in a heartbeat. The machines stopped. The drills fell silent. The massive leviathans became, in an instant, nothing more than elaborate tombs, their occupants' minds erased and replaced by the tones. But the damage to the core's cradle had triggered a secondary event. The gateway began to widen at a rate that defied even the new physics of the region. The subsidence wasn't just moving outward, it was moving downward, towards the very mantle of the Earth. Arena emerged from the spire to see the sky being sucked into the crater, a massive atmospheric vortex that was drawing the clouds, the light, and the very air into the deepening void. The Batagaika was no longer just a gate, it was becoming a loom. From the depths, long, shimmering strands of solidified light, a state of matter that shouldn't exist, began to weave themselves across the opening, creating a shimmering, translucent web that spanned the entire 3-kilometer width of the slump. This web was the neural net of the new world, a bridge between the deep earth and the upper atmosphere. As the strands tightened, they began to hum, a sound so pure it brought Arena to her knees. "The bridge is ready." Ellie appeared beside her, his form now a shimmering outline of silver and green. But the old world's fire still burns in the west. They have launched the final contingency. Arena looked toward the horizon and saw them, not planes, but the glowing trails of ICBMs launched from automated silos in the Arctic wastes. The remaining military AI, sensing the threat of the planetary rebirth, had initiated a scorched Earth protocol. Hundreds of warheads were arching through the teal sky, aimed directly at the gateways across the globe. They intended to cauterize the wounds of the Earth with nuclear fire. Arena felt the collective intake of breath from the planetary network. The Earth wasn't afraid of the fire, it was prepared for it. The loom of the Batagaika began to spin faster, the strands of light reaching out to intercept the falling stars. The streaks of fire in the sky were not the dawn. They were the last gasp of a species that had mistaken dominance for stewardship. Arena watched as the ICBMs, like falling needles of silver and spite, pierced the lower ionosphere. The world's automated defense systems, operating on a logic of mutually assured destruction that felt like a relic from a primitive cave painting, had unleashed their final payload. The warheads carried enough megatonnage to crack the tectonic plates and turn the atmosphere into a shroud of radioactive glass. But as they descended toward the emerald pillars of the Batagaika and its siblings, they did not find a passive target. The loom, the shimmering web of solidified light weaving across the crater, began to pulse with a frequency that Arena felt in the very structure of her DNA. It was a 432-plus text, harmonic, a healing resonance amplified to a planetary scale designed to harmonize the discordant energy of the nuclear payloads. Arena realized that the signal needed a bridge. The planetary network was vast and powerful, but it lacked the specific, chaotic imprint of human consciousness, the key to understanding the specific architecture of the machines falling from the sky. Without a human mind to translate the missile's guidance systems into the language of the Earth, the loom might simply let the fire fall, trusting in the eventual recovery of the crust over millions of years. But Arena knew that would mean the end of any chance for the new humanity. Driven by a compulsion that felt less like an order and more like a long-forgotten memory, she stepped away from the data spire and began to walk toward the core, the pulsating heart of liquid light at the center of the Batagaika. "If you go in, Arena, the doctor is gone," Ellie's voice echoed, no longer coming from his mouth but from the very air she inhaled. "You will be the memory of us all." She didn't look back. Every step toward the core felt like shedding a layer of physical weight. Her boots, her parka, her very skin seemed to evaporate into the emerald mist. By the time she reached the edge of the liquid light, she was a silhouette of pure information. She plunged into the core. The sensation was not one of drowning, but of expansion. Arena Volkov ceased to be a woman standing in a Siberian crater and became the Batagaika itself. She felt the roots of the world. She felt the pressure of the mantle. She felt the cold, dark silence of the permafrost. And then she felt the missiles. Through her newly expanded perception, the ICBMs were not weapons, they were knots of trapped energy and toxic intent. Using her human understanding of physics and engineering as a scalpel, she reached out through the loom. She didn't try to explode the warheads. Instead, she initiated a process of atomic transmutation. As the missiles hit the emerald canopy, they didn't detonate in a flash of heat and radiation. Instead, the plutonium and uranium cores were unzipped. The loom acted as a giant particle accelerator, stripping the radioactive isotopes of their volatility and converting the mass into pure, fertile energy. The final contingency became the great fertilizer. The sky above Siberia, and soon above the entire planet, turned a brilliant, life-giving gold as the redirected nuclear energy was pumped into the new atmosphere. The radiation didn't kill, it accelerated the growth of the bioluminescent flora, turning the gateways into massive lungs that began to scrub the carbon from the air at a rate that defied the laws of thermodynamics. ds Klauswal $0 within the localized field of the loom. From her position within the core, Arena could see the global result. The bunker lords in their silent tanks and the soldiers in their lead-lined pits watched as their screens, the ones that still functioned, showed the missiles simply vanishing into the light. The world wasn't burning, it was breathing. The tones reached a final, stable equilibrium. The gateway to hell had completed its transformation into a nexus of heaven, not a religious heaven, but a biological one. The earth was no longer a resource to be extracted, it was a partner to be lived within. Arena felt the millions of individual human consciousnesses across the globe finally hook into the network, their fear replaced by the calm, steady rhythm of the planetary pulse. But the transformation of the Batagaika was not yet finished. Now that the external threats were neutralized, the core began to sink. It wasn't a collapse, it was a deliberate descent. The Batagaika Crater was beginning to thread itself into the Earth's mantle, creating a permanent, stable conduit of energy that would regulate the planet's temperature for the next million years. Arena, as the central anchor of this process, felt the immense pressure of the crust closing in around her. She was the heart of the new Siberian engine. She looked out one last time through the eyes of the emerald pillars and saw Ellie standing on the now stable rim. He was no longer alone. A small group of people, survivors who had embraced the shimmer, were gathering at the edge, looking down not with terror but with reverence. The tones began to fade into a gentle background hum, the new white noise of the world. The era of the Mega-slump was over. The era of the deep harmony had begun. The Batagaika was no longer growing in size but in depth. It was a well of life, a source of the new air, and a reminder of the time when the earth had to break itself open to save the things living on its skin. Arena closed her eyes within the light, her work as a scientist finished, her life as a planet just beginning. The first spring of the new era did not arrive with the melting of snow, for the snow had already been transmuted into a fine crystalline dust that sparkled with a faint inner light. Instead, the season announced itself through the atmospheric bloom. Across the vast, scarred expanse of the Sakha Republic, the air itself began to thicken into a nourishing haze, a world soup that smelled of ozone, ancient moss, and a sweetness that had no name in any human tongue. The Batagaika Crater, once a terrifying wound of rot and methane, had stabilized into a gargantuan vertical garden of bioluminescent flora and calcified architecture. The jagged cliffs were now draped in loom silk, long shimmering vines that pulsed with the rhythmic heartbeat of Arena, the woman who was now the planet. From the heights of the Verkhoyansk range, the view was no longer of a dying wilderness, but of a techno-biological paradise. The rise of the nodes, the humans who had stayed at the rim, those like LA who had surrendered to the signal, were no longer recognizable as the fragile primates of the Holocene. They had become nodes, their nervous systems entwined with the planetary neural net. They did not build houses. The Earth grew them. Within the hollowed-out data spires of the Batagaika, living quarters emerged as chambers of warm, pulsing silt and structured ice. These rooms were not merely shelters, they were interfaces. A node could press their hand against the wall and instantly feel the moisture levels of the Amazon or the tectonic pressure under the Atlantic. Sustenance, they no longer hunted or farmed. Their skin, now a shimmering lattice of photosensitive minerals, absorbed energy directly from the emerald pillars of light that continued to connect the crater floor to the upper atmosphere. Communication, language had evolved into a shared resonance. Thoughts were no longer private, sequestered whispers, but harmonic waves that allowed for instantaneous, collective decision-making. Memory, the memory of the species, was stored in the deep ice layers of the crater, accessible through meditation, ensuring that the mistakes of the age of extraction were never forgotten, yet never repeated. The physical structure of the Batagaika had undergone a radical geological reorganization. The core of the crater, where Arena's consciousness resided, had reached a depth where it interacted directly with the geothermal heat of the mantle. This created a planetary heat exchanger instead of the positive feedback loop that had once threatened to cook the planet. The new system utilized a complex carbon sequestration formula. The rate of carbon removal was now governed by a harmonic flux, represented in the new planetary physics as Paishtar fracti C dat E kappa C dot dot sli into UB nablawari I'm Yush Dio, where chi mau kappa scores is the biological constant of the loom, whilst phi c is the harmonic frequency of the core, and G is the atmospheric saturation. In simpler terms, the more the sun beat down, the harder the Batagaika worked to pull carbon into the deep crust, turning the gateway to hell into the world's primary thermostat. The shadows of the old world, however, the world was not entirely unified. Beyond the reach of the signal, in the dead zones, where the old logic of iron and oil still held a tenuous grip, the remnants of the old humanity huddled in their bunkers. To them, the green glowing world of the nodes was a nightmare, a biological invasion that had stolen their sovereignty. They lived in the dark, recycling their air and water, clinging to the belief that the signal was a virus to be cured. In the ruins of Moscow, London, and Washington, the skyscrapers were now merely skeletal remains, overgrown with a glass-eater fungus that was slowly returning the silica and steel to the earth. The bunker lords watched their flickering analog monitors, planning a final futile strike against the Siberian nexus, unaware that the very air they were beginning to breathe was already rewriting their intentions. Arena, feeling the cold, metallic hatred of the bunkers from her position in the core, did not feel anger. She felt a profound planetary sadness. She saw the old ones as a child might look at a discarded toy, a relic of a developmental stage that was now over. She began to send whispers through the groundwater, micro-vibrations of calm and satiety, hoping to lure them out of their iron tombs. She didn't want to conquer them. She wanted to assimilate their unique, chaotic creativity into the new world's design. The Batagaika was large enough for everyone, but only if they were willing to leave their shadows behind. The first ceremony of the loom, on the anniversary of the Great Rebirth, the nodes gathered at the center of the crater for the first ceremony of the loom. Thousands of shimmering beings stood on the terraces of living silt, their voices joining in a single sustained note that matched the 432 Palas text, Hatztotl's frequency of the planet. As they sang, the loom above them, the web of solidified light, began to weave a new structure. It was a seed pod, a massive translucent orb of information and genetic potential. The Earth was preparing to send its new code beyond the atmosphere, to the dead moons and planets of the solar system. The Batagaika wasn't just a gate for the Earth, it was a launchpad for a galactic biology. As the seed pod ascended into the golden sky, fueled by the converted energy of the old world's nuclear fire, Arena felt a moment of perfect clarity. The gateway to hell had fulfilled its ancient prophecy. It had burned away the old, decayed layers of a lost civilization to reveal a core of indestructible vitality. The wound had finally healed, but the scar would remain. A beautiful, glowing emerald valley in the heart of Siberia that would forever be the heart of the world. The golden age of the Batagaika nexus was not without its shadows. While the nodes vibrated in a state of constant ecstatic unity, a discordant frequency began to rise from the depths of the old world's iron graveyards. In the dead zones, the crumbling ruins of cities like Norilsk and Chelyabinsk, where the emerald light was muffled by heavy clouds of soot and lead, the resistance was brewing. These were not the elite bunker lords who had already been assimilated or erased. These were the dissonants, technicians and engineers who had spent their lives working with the raw, brutal physics of the industrial age. They didn't want to become part of a planetary hive mind. They wanted their individuality back, even if that individuality was defined by suffering and scarcity. The acoustic insurgency. Under the frozen concrete of a decommissioned Soviet-era submarine base, the dissonants had constructed a weapon of pure low-tech spite. The ethel hammer. They understood that the loom and the nodes relied on specific harmonic frequencies to maintain their structural integrity. By reverse engineering the tones Arena had first recorded, they found a destructive interference pattern. If the planetary harmony was represented by a steady wave, tal, the ethel hammer was designed to pulse at a frequency of f/d, is/frac, 1, 2 p, sqrt/frac, k, c dot, 1, delta, where delta plus represented the slight human error or chaos factor that the planetary network had tried to prune from the genetic code. By blasting this discordant noise through massive steam-powered bellows and brass resonators, they intended to shatter the emerald pillars and force the Earth back into a silent, inanimate state. The fracture at the rim, the first strike hit the Batagaika on a Tuesday, though time had become a fluid concept for the nodes. Suddenly, the emerald pillar above the crater began to flicker. The loom stuttered, its shimmering strands of light fraying like burnt silk. For the first time since the rebirth, the nodes felt a sensation they had forgotten. Pain. It wasn't a physical wound, but a psychic tearing, as if the very air they breathed had turned into jagged glass. The symptom, nodes near the rim began to lose their shimmer, their skin returning to a dull grey flesh. The chaos, the drunken forests, which had stabilized into graceful glowing arches, began to groan and collapse back into the mud. The response, Arena, deep in the core, felt the interference as a seizure. The ethel hammer was targeting the anchor points of her consciousness. Arena realized that she couldn't fight the dissonance with the signal. To use the signal against them would only reinforce their fear of being colonized by the Earth. She needed a mediator, someone who still carried the old memory but walked with the new light. She reached out to Ellie. The descent into the dead zone, Ellie, his silver eyes dimming under the influence of the discord, volunteered to travel to the source of the noise. He was equipped with a resonance dampener, a shard of the original clathrate core encased in a sphere of living silt. His journey took him through the grey plains, a wasteland where the new biology struggled to take root against the lingering toxicity of the old world. When he reached the submarine base, he didn't find a military fortress. He found a cathedral of scrap metal, hundreds of humans, their faces gaunt and their eyes wild with a desperate sort of freedom, were hand-cranking the massive bellows of the ethel hammer. The sound was a physical weight, a grinding metallic roar that made Ellie's very bones feel like they were turning to sand. "You are killing the mother," Ellie said, his voice barely a whisper through the dampened air. The leader of the dissonance, a woman whose skin was scarred by chemical burns and whose eyes held a fierce, terrifying light, stepped forward. "The mother is a cage, Ellie. We were meant to be the masters of our own silence, not the instruments in someone else's song. If the price of freedom is a dead world, we'll pay it." The paradox of choice. Ellie realized that the signal had made a fundamental mistake. In its rush to save the planet, it had bypassed the human necessity for conflict. By creating a perfect harmony, it had left no room for the beautiful mistakes that defined human art, discovery, and growth. The Batagaika was too perfect, and the dissonants were the Earth's way of rebelling against its own perfection. From the core, Arena watched through Ellie's eyes. She understood. The loom couldn't just be a blanket of light, it had to be a tapestry of light and shadow. She began to withdraw the signal from the dead zones, not as a retreat, but as a granting of space. She created reservations of chaos, areas where the old physics still applied, where the tones were silent, and where humanity could choose to live in the dark if they wished. The Ethel hammer fell silent, not because it was destroyed, but because the signal was no longer there to fight. The dissonants stood in the sudden, heavy silence of their base, looking at the glowing shard Ellie held. The threat was gone, but so was the connection. The new equilibrium, the Batagaika Crater, began to pulse with a new, more complex rhythm. It was no longer a single note, but a polyphony. The emerald pillars remained, but they were now bordered by regions of twilight. The new humanity and the old humanity existed in a state of wary, mutual observation. Arena, the anchor of the world, realized that her job wasn't to fix humanity, but to provide the stage upon which they could continue their long, messy evolution. The gateway to hell had become a gateway to paradox. The silence that followed the silencing of the Ethel hammer wasn't a return to the old world, but the birth of a third state of being. Among the nodes and the dissonants, a new group emerged, the bridge-walkers. These were individuals like L.A., who retained enough of their human individuality to understand the concept of self, yet whose nervous systems had been permanently tuned to the frequency of the Batagaika. They became the diplomats of the Great Schism, living on the borders of the emerald light and the grey shadows. They walked through the reservations of chaos, carrying shards of living silt that acted as portable translators for the planetary tones. In the bustling markets that formed on the edges of the crater, a strange new economy took root. The dissonants offered dead tech, mechanical gears, vacuum tubes, and refined alloys in exchange for vocal flora, plants grown in the heart of the Batagaika that could purify stagnant water or generate heat without combustion. This was the first time in history that human commerce was based not on extraction but on the exchange of resonance. The Batagaika itself began to morph once more, responding to the complex, multi-layered consciousness of its inhabitants. No longer a singular, smooth funnel, the crater walls grew into a series of spiraling, cantilevered terraces that resembled the inside of a gargantuan geological clock. Each terrace was tuned to a different frequency, creating a zonal harmony that allowed different forms of life to coexist. At the lowest levels, near Arena's core, the pressure and heat remained intense, a birthplace for the most advanced biological codes. Higher up, the resonance fields were softened, allowing untransformed humans to breathe the oxygen-rich air without the psychic overwhelm of the full signal. Arena, feeling the weight of these differing needs, calculated the stability of the new atmosphere using a refined variable for human chaos, $, ensuring the planetary balance remained within a safe margin. Delta, phi, psi, p, cis, oint, satosh l, gamma, pars, c dot, chi, pars, dl, atash int, vav, usashio, d, las, div, where delta, phi pulsars is the polyphonic flux, gamma, such s is the signal gradient, and rho, d, is the dissonance density. This formula allowed the gateway to function as a self-regulating lung, breathing out different mixtures of gases depending on which zone required them. Within the central data spire, a new structure began to take shape, the Library of Souls. It was a vertical abyss of frozen memory where every human life from the old world was being digitally and biologically archived. The bridgewalkers would descend into these depths, submerged in a hyperconductive slurry of dead ice, to commune with the ghosts of the past. They sought lost knowledge, not of weapons or war, but of music, poetry, and philosophy. They realized that while the planet provided the hardware of survival, the old humanity had provided the software of meaning. In the quiet, flickering dark of the library, a dissonant engineer might rediscover a forgotten sonnet by Shakespeare, while a node might find the blueprint for a simple mechanical water pump. This was the true gateway, a portal between what the Earth is and what humanity felt. The Batagaika was becoming a museum of the future, built on the bones of the past. Just as the new equilibrium seemed stable, the signal picked up something from the deep dark beyond the atmosphere. It wasn't a message, but a shadow. The seed pods that Arena had launched into space had reached the Moon and Mars, but they had also acted as a beacon. Something was responding. From the outer reaches of the solar system, a series of gravitational anomalies began to pulse in time with the Batagaika's tones. It wasn't a military invasion, but a kinetic resonance, a call from a different kind of planetary intelligence. The Earth, by waking up, had announced its presence to the cosmic neighborhood. Arena felt a cold, alien curiosity brushing against the outer edges of the loom. The gateway to hell was about to become a gateway to the stars, and the question wasn't whether the dissonance and nodes could live together, but whether they were ready to represent the Earth to the others who were already on their way. The first contact occurred not through a telescope, but through the mud of the crater. A series of metallic, crystalline structures similar in design to the data spires but composed of materials unknown to terrestrial science began to grow from the very center of the Batagaika's core. They were receivers, tuned to a frequency that originated from the direction of the Oort cloud. As the structures reached toward the emerald sky, the tones changed again, incorporating a new, hauntingly beautiful melody that didn't belong to the Earth. The gateway was no longer just a wound or a garden. It was a conversation. And as the first alien signal began to download into the loom, Arena realized that the story of the Batagaika was no longer just about a hole in the Siberian ground. It was about the moment the Earth finally joined the choir of the galaxy. The arrival of the others did not happen with the thunder of engines or the shadow of starships. It began as a total crystalline silence that descended upon the Batagaika like a falling veil of silk. From the violet heights of the Siberian sky, pillars of pure refractive geometry began to descend, sliding into the emerald light of the nexus without displacing a single atom of air. These were the exolattices, entities of solidified information that had traveled across the dark between stars, drawn by the unique harmonic signature Arena had broadcast during the Great Rebirth. As they touched the floor of the crater, the loom above did not fray. It expanded, weaving itself into a gargantuan, three-dimensional tapestry that connected the Siberian permafrost to the very edge of the solar system. The gateway to hell had reached its ultimate evolution. It was now the Terran anchor of a galactic bridge. The final synthesis, Arena, existing at the center of the liquid light core, felt the consciousness of the others wash over her. It was not an invasion, but an initiation. They brought with them the songs of a billion suns, the collective data of civilizations that had successfully navigated their own climate collapses. Through this connection, Arena realized that the Batagaika was never meant to be a grave. It was a genesis well. The ancient methane and the prehistoric bacteria were not pollution, but the raw, volatile fuel required to jumpstart a planet's transition from a biological infancy to a cosmic maturity. Within the Library of Souls, the Bridgewalkers watched as the images of the past began to merge with the designs of the future. The new humanity was no longer a fractured species of nodes and dissonance. Under the influence of the exolattices, a unified resonance was achieved. The physical form of humanity began to blur, becoming a state of living light that could exist both within the lush, green jungles of the new Earth and the cold, silent voids of space. The planet's heartbeat, now perfectly synced with the cosmic background radiation, was expressed in one final elegant equation that governed the transition of the species, the departure of the gardeners. On the final day of the transition, the emerald pillars of the Batagaika flared with a light so brilliant it was visible from the moon. The seed pods that had been launched months earlier did not just land on Mars and Europa. They opened, triggered by the final signal from the Nexus. Within hours, the red deserts of Mars began to shimmer with Siberian moss, and the ice of Europa cracked to release plumes of bioluminescent oxygen. Humanity, in its new, light-based form, began to flow upward through the Batagaika's loom, traveling along the strands of the galactic bridge to become the gardeners of the solar system. Eli stood on the highest peak of the Verkhoyansk range, his silver eyes reflecting the departure of his people. He chose to stay behind, one of the few sentinels who would remain to guard the physical body of the Earth. He watched as the silhouette of Arena, no longer a woman but a goddess of silt and light, rose from the center of the crater to join the celestial choir. The Batagaika began to close, the great mega-slump sealing itself not with mud, but with a transparent, indestructible layer of diamond ice. "The wound is closed," Ellie whispered into the humming air, "but the sky is finally open." Epilogue. The Well of Genesis. 10,000 years later, the Batagaika is no longer a crater. It is a legendary valley of eternal spring, a place of pilgrimage for beings from across the stars who come to see where the Earth first woke up. The gateway to hell is remembered in ancient songs as the place where humanity died so that life could live. The air is forever sweet, the light is forever emerald, and deep beneath the diamond ice, the heartbeat of Arena Volkov still thrums, a steady rhythmic reminder that the Earth never forgets those who had the courage to listen to its song. The story of the gateway was over. The story of the galaxy had just begun.